example, the irony that the outsiders understand Jesus while those who have the scriptures seem to misunderstand him. Most scholars divide Mark's gospel into two stages, and they hinge on the statement of Peter that's found in chapter 8, identifying Jesus as the Christ. In the first half of the gospel, we see Jesus in Galilee, and we see him portrayed as a powerful and authoritative herald of God's inbreaking rule or kingdom. In the second part, where we move towards Jerusalem and see the events in Jerusalem, we have the destiny of the Son of Man who must suffer and die. And so we have a clear shift in the atmosphere and the content of the gospel in these two parts. Do keep in mind that some scholars identify the Passion itself as part 3 of the gospel. I would hold to the two-part structure while acknowledging the special status of the Passion. So again, in our first part, Jesus is going to preach, heal, teach. He does all of this in the service of the proclamation of the kingdom, and his authority is made very apparent. So, for example, when he calls the disciples, their response is quite immediate, and we see him act in a rapid succession in terms of his healings and exorcisms. So again, demonstrating his authority. Mark's portrait of Jesus is a narrative Christology. Now, he does give us titles for Jesus. In that sense, he gives us a conceptual Christology. But those titles are set into a narrative. So as we examine the picture of Jesus, it's not just the titles that are applied to him, but also the story itself reveals truths. For example, in the way others react to Jesus, what they hope for from him, how they interrelate with him, his own actions, the consistency of his actions, the compassion of his actions, for example, in the feeding of the crowds. In so many ways, the story reveals who Jesus is, and above all, it does so in the picture of Jesus as the one who suffers in faithful obedience to the Father. But keep in mind that the prologue, the very beginning of this gospel, the first verse really identifies Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. It then remains, though, to play out how this anointed Son of God proclaims in Galilee and its environment the imminence of God's reign in teaching and action. But this same Jesus, from the very beginning, faces misunderstanding and opposition. Of course, at the heart of Mark's picture of Jesus is the fact that he suffers. So in chapter 8:29, we've already alluded to Peter's famous statement when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter responds, "You are the Christ." And notice that the following response of Jesus is quite immediate. This is the first of 3 major passion predictions that occurs in the gospel. It tells us right away that there's a shift now in what's happening, but most importantly, it tells us what it means to be Messiah. So Peter has identified Jesus as Messiah, but he clearly doesn't understand the significance, because he's going to object in just a moment to what Jesus says, which is that the Messiah must suffer and die. A crucial moment for Mark's portrait of Jesus occurs in chapter 15, verse 39, when the centurion identifies Jesus as the Son of God. He is in fact the first human character in the narrative to fully and correctly identify Jesus. Now, God has identified Jesus as the beloved Son, and even the demons have identified Jesus, but all of the human characters have misunderstood it until this point. The theological point being, you cannot understand who Jesus is until you understand his destiny to suffer and die. And this is a crucial question to keep in mind when we look at some of the controversies that arise with regard to Mark's gospel. For example, the so-called messianic secret, which we'll look at shortly. It's very important to understand this simple fact, that for Mark, you cannot understand who Jesus is or what it means to be Messiah, Son of Man, Son of God, Holy One of Israel. You cannot understand any of these titles applied to Jesus unless you understand this fundamental truth, that this is God's will, that Jesus give his life in faithful obedience to the Father.